Hi everybody, this lecture is on psychological measurement. This lecture will be probably a bit shorter than previous lectures. Previous lectures were pretty big and complex topics. Not that this is not a big topic or complex, but probably a little bit more straightforward in terms of what we need to learn for this class. So psychological measurement. So when we do research, obviously, we need to be able to measure the psychological constructs, the concepts that we're interested in terms of our research question and hypotheses. And in this class, we're going to emphasize quantitative measurement methodologies, which means you come up with numbers. You have scores expressed as numbers. Those numbers can differ in terms of their nature depending on the levels of measurement. If you don't remember levels of measurement, you should review that from your stats. So levels of measurement are nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio. So nominal is a category. So it's a category. It's just a name. So the number is actually just the name of the category. So we're limited in terms of what sort of statistics, what sort of mathematical operations we can do with nominal level variables. So nominal level variables are used sometimes to compare groups of people. So in your things such as your independent t-test and your one-way ANOVAs, you're comparing different groups of people. You're using nominal variables. You're also using nominal variables for the paired t-test and the repeated measures ANOVA, except you're just giving all the participants all levels of that nominal variable, which is your ID. And also you've learned chi-square. So chi-square, you're trying to find a relationship between two nominal variables. So there's limitations in what we can do in terms of the mathematics of nominal variables. There's ordinal. The variables, yes, is more or less. So there's like rank order would be an example of a ordinal level of measurement. You can say something's more or less, but we don't know the distance between the numbers. So if I ask you to rank your favorite activities in your free time, playing sports, watching Netflix, hanging out with friends, and I ask you to put one for your favorite, second for your next favorite, and third for the last, we don't know the distance between those two things, those numbers. We only know that one is greater than another, but it could be very close. So maybe playing sports and hanging out with your friends are very close, although you put sports first. But the number two is very close. And maybe you hate Netflix, and so you hate sitting around watching TV only. So maybe 3 is really far from number 2. So in terms of ordinal data, we can just say it's more or less, but we don't know how far it is, and that also limits our mathematical operations we can do with those numbers. I'm not sure about your class. In my stats class, we only learned one ordinal statistic just to sort of show you what it's like. We learned a Spearman correlation, which is for ordinal data. But what I'll say is, in general, for our class, we're going to assume approximation of measurement at the interval level scale. So interval level scale is you have more or less, so you have the numbers, they're more or less, but here we assume equal distance between the numbers. So many of you have seen Likert scales where there's numbers 1 through 4, 1 through 5, 1 through 7, and you choose a number that is your answer. So there's a range of answers, 1 through 4, let's say, strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then you choose the answer that you think relates to you, your feeling about the question. So basically, we could have long debates about whether that's truly ordinal or truly interval. In statistics, what we tend to do, we say, okay, you guys go off and have fun if you want to debate that for hours, but all we'll say is that a lot of the statistics that we use in stats class and in this class are going to assume approximation of interval level measurements. So those statistics that we're going to be using, we just need to say approximates interval level measurement. So in the t-test, your independent variable is going to be nominal. So you have a nominal level variable, but you're looking at the differences in that nominal level variable in terms of interval level scales. So I give the example frequently, and I'm going to use this throughout the class. The old sort of red is, does red produce more attraction? So you have a red color that you show people, a blue color that you show people. So when I say show people, it's somebody's in a red shirt or a blue shirt, and you compare the attraction rating. So the color, the IV, is nominal. Their categories, red, blue. And then the attraction scores, let's say, are 1 through 10. So we're going to say that approximates interval level measurement. So we can do t-test. We can do ANOVA. So if we have more than 2 levels, so if we have 3 or more levels, so we have red, green, and blue, we have a nominal level variable with 3 levels. We have an interval level variable as the outcome, attraction. So we can simply do an ANOVA in that case. And then something like, if you're correlating, let's say, narcissism, and I rate it on a interval level scale, and then I have aggression, and that's rated on an interval level scale, I can do things like simple regression or a Pearson correlation, because those statistics relate to interval level measured variables against each other. So those are the major levels of variables that we usually deal in psychology. Ratio level measurement, ratio, remember, is the same as interval, but there's a true zero. So the difference between interval and ratio is that there's a true zero. So in psychology, we usually don't have a true zero. So if I'm going to rate your level of narcissism, I can't say you have no narcissism. You would be not here. You wouldn't exist. Everybody has at least a very, very small degree of it. Just like any sort of personality thing, you can't say, well, I guess in everyday life we say somebody has no personality, but in scientific research we can't say you have no personality. You just have some personality characteristics, more or less of them. So in psychology we don't have a lot of ratio measured variables. And I'm just trying to think about our studies. I think in our data sets that we have, I am pretty sure that we don't have any ratio level measure variables. So we're pretty much going to be dealing with the nominal and the interval. So when we say quantitative, we end up with numeric scores, even if they're a nominal level variable and we're capturing some sort of category that somebody's in. There are other approaches, qualitative approaches to research. We do not cover that in this class. I'm guessing basically sometimes undergraduates have exposure to this, but for the most part, you would have to be in graduate school and learn about qualitative methodologies. Qualitative just basically is the contrast to quantitative, which means there's no numbers. So they give what's called thick description. Well, I shouldn't say all qualitative, but basically it's words. So in quantitative, your data that you analyze are numbers. In qualitative, the data that you're analyzing are words. Those words could be brief. They could just be keywords that people put in terms of how they associate. Let's say if you were doing brand research, you might say, when you think of this brand of soap, what words come to your mind? So even though there's not much of a narrative, there's just some words that people are saying, that would be qualitative. Then sometimes you have qualitative research where the researcher themselves will go somewhere usually a naturalistic setting, and watch people, and they'll take a lot of detailed notes about what people are doing. So if you know some anthropological approaches to studying human behavior, a lot of cultural anthropologists use qualitative methods where they go and are participant observers in different cultures, and then they take a bunch of notes on their observations. So those notes are qualitative data. And we can combine these things. So we're not going to be looking at this in this class, but the trans identity study that some of you are using for your research project, there's actually some qualitative data there. So I have quantitative data on things like identity development, romantic attachment. So I have numbers that we can analyze. But then, I also asked some qualitative questions. I think there was 3 of them. The first question was, think of your best romantic relationship. How did it affect your identity development? This is identity development as a trans person. Question number 2 was, think of your worst relationship, your worst romantic relationship. How did it affect your identity development? And then the third question was, think about your identity development. How has that influenced your romantic relationships? And what I'll say is those qualitative data really gave an interesting picture of different, as I call them, different pathways. So it showed a lot more sort of diverse, I shouldn't say a lot more, but it showed the diversity in people's viewpoints of this in terms of identity development. So some people said, well, my identity development and my romantic relationships are separate. They're just separate parts of my life. They don't connect. Other people, the romantic relationships had a major influence, good or bad, on their identity development. So it illustrated sort of a diversity of approaches, you will, in terms of the identity development in relationship to relationships, romantic relationships. And so I have the quantitative data that gives me some really great numbers and can show patterns, but then I have the qualitative data that shows a little bit more deeper about what's going on behind the numbers. So you can combine them in a way that is useful in that each piece of data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, will help explain the other part. And when we're talking about psychological measurement, we're talking about this thing called psychometrics. So if you ever hear the word psychometrics, it deals with psychological measurement. So metric is measurement. It is how we measure things. And then psychological measurement. And we're going to talk a bit about different methodologies, because there's different ways we can measure things in terms of quantitative measurement. Again, we're going to talk about quantitative. We're not going to talk about qualitative here. And a big key about these measurements, these different methods, they tell us a different aspect about people. So as we're going through this, each type of methodology tells us something different about somebody, about an individual, about our participants. And it's good if a single study has multiple methods. It's not always possible. It wasn't possible in the trans study, for example, because we didn't have money to do any other methodology besides self-reports. And in contrast, the romantic attachment study has multiple methods. It has interview, observer ratings of attachment, and we can correlate that to all sorts of self-reports. So that would be a multi-method study. So when possible, using different methodologies in a study is good. Why is it? Because there's this thing called method variance. So each way of finding out about somebody has some sort of bias to it. So if you just use, let's say, just self-reports, there might be a bias in the self-reports that exaggerates the correlations of the things that are being measured. So when possible, doing multiple methods is good because you get away from this thing called method variance. So if you get two different types of methodologies and they're relating, then there's something really there. If you're using the same methodology and you're getting correlations with your variables, there's always a possibility it's just because of the bias in that measurement. But basically, we all know that we can't be perfect in one study, so what we want is in that nomological network, we want to have different people using different methods. So I already mentioned that we don't want to do replication a lot of times in psychology because I can see real disaster in that. Let's say somebody does a study and they use a certain methodology, and then somebody repeats the same thing and they find the same stuff, but then is it really the research question that you're supporting, or is it just something about the methodology that could be possibly strange? And so in the nomological network, we want different researchers in different places using different methodologies, addressing similar research questions, and if different researchers in different places using different research methodologies say roughly the same thing about the research question, then we have some pretty strong evidence that something's going on. So while we might not be able to do a lot of multi-method studies within one study, the multi-method nature should come out in the nomological network with different people. So let's go through the methods. So that was the bigger picture of the methods. So the specific methods, and you might sort of understand these as we go through, they're pretty straightforward, I think. So one method to measure things psychologically, quantitatively, is self-reports. So they can be questionnaires. So questionnaires would be a great example of a self-report. So for all studies in this class except for the ratings of the job candidate study, they're self-report questionnaires. So you just ask somebody, you can also do this with interviews. So if you do an interview and you simply record as your data what they say, that would also be a self-report. What I'll say about that, though, that would be a big waste of time. If you're doing an interview and all you're doing is recording what the person says, probably you're wasting a lot of money. You should think about how that could be done with questionnaires. Again, the endpoint of what they say is quantitative data. So somebody's going to put numbers to their answers. It's not the words. Somebody's going to code the words into numbers. Again, that would be a big waste of time to do interviews. I think you would only do that type of thing if you feel like people will not be able to give you extended answers using questionnaires. You need somebody there to clarify things, to dig deeper. So self-report, basically the picture that we're getting of the person is their perspective. What do they think about themselves? So we're going to look at good things and bad things for each. So obviously with self-report, a good thing about that is sometimes people are the best expert about themselves. They know themselves better than other people. They have access to all this stuff that goes on in their brain that other people may not be aware of at all. So the big advantage of self-reports is that sometimes people have access to all this information about themselves that other people do not. The downside is several. So one is the downside is, the big downside I would say in terms of method is those things, the self-report, are valid if several things happen. One thing is they need to understand the question. So if they don't understand your question, the data that you get will be invalid. They're answering something else. So if you do questionnaires, for example, you have to work really hard to make sure those questionnaire questions are very understandable to people. And then the second thing is they tell you the truth. So one, they need to understand the question, and two, they need to tell you the truth for those data to be valid. There's a couple reasons, at least a couple reasons why people may not tell you the truth. One is that they might not have very good self-insight. So if they don't have good self-insight, when you ask them something about themselves, they're not going to give you a very accurate answer because they're defensive, they're not aware of these things that they're doing. On that note, if you remember, I mentioned in the romantic attachment study, we have interview measures of attachment and we have self-report measures of attachment. And we actually did a study on all of those data, not from this study, but from another study, which we conducted. And basically what we found out was secure people and preoccupied people are pretty good in terms of self-report. Secure people are pretty aware of themselves. Preoccupied people are pretty aware that they're anxious. Dismissing people, however, they think they're secure. And so when you do self-report questionnaires, you're going to have a lot of noise, a lot of wrong answers, if you will, wrong data for dismissing people, because on the self-report they're showing up as secure when they're really dismissing. So that's the case where I don't think the dismissing people are lying to us on purpose. They really truly think that they're healthy and fine, but they're not. They're dismissing. And then the other reason why somebody might not tell you the truth is that they're just plain lying. And so sometimes people will lie. Sometimes they'll lie because a couple reasons. One is that there's some pressure. So there's some sort of what we call valence. There's some sort of possible judgment they might feel based on the question. So like if you were trying to study aggression and you say something like, I often get angry and yell at people. Well, for most of us, that's kind of a negative thing. If it sounds like you're yelling at people all the time, it sounds bad, right? So you might underreport how much you do that because it sounds bad doing that. So there might be that pressure to look good. Sometimes people might lie because they want to screw us up. And so once in a great while when you do research, you'll get some people who are resentful because they're doing the research because maybe they're doing it for a class and they're doing it for a class credit and they don't really want to do it. And so they'll come in with a bad attitude and they'll try to screw up your study. So there's a possibility that people might lie because of that. So self-reports, there's some good things, there's some bad things. With the bad things, sometimes we can have these things called lie skills. We'll talk about that later. Basically, we can try to detect whether somebody's trying to look really good or try to look bad. Also, we might identify people's answers that are sporadic. So if we have people that have very sporadic answers, they don't make sense, then we start wondering whether they're just kind of randomly putting things and they're not really reading the question, not really thinking about things. So sometimes we look at, for example, how long people take to do the questionnaire. So a lot of questionnaires nowadays, I think, are good if they're online. And when you do online questionnaires, you can actually you can know how long somebody takes to take your questionnaire. And so if you find out, somebody's taking 3 minutes on a questionnaire that should take 15 minutes, you might think about eliminating their answers, their data, because it looks like they probably didn't take it seriously. Observer reports. So here we have somebody, hopefully it's a trained expert. Usually observer means a trained expert. It could be research assistants. And typically what they'll do is they typically will observe somebody doing a task or maybe doing an interview. And if you do the interview techniques, what I'll say is doing observer data means that you're examining how somebody says things, not what they say. If it's what they say, if it's just simply what they said, then it's a self-report. But a really good use of interviews is having observer reports of the interview. So how they say things. Again, there would be a lot of training. There'd have to be a coding system. For observer reports, you have a coding system. So there'd be a very systematic coding system that you would pilot, you would try out, and then you would make it very systematic. You would train people to do this. You would, in your training, you would have them marked up against some sort of standard, make sure that they're able to do it against the standard. And then as people are doing this with different participants, you compare different observers. So you don't have just one observer. You need at least 2 observers per participant. Why is that? Because we want to make sure that there's that objectivity, that if I see something, you see something also. It's not going to be 100% perfect. So if you're measuring something complex, you don't expect 100% agreement, but you expect a relatively high agreement. And so when you're doing observational techniques that are quantitative, you need more than one person, and you need to compare people's ratings to make sure they're basically seeing the same stuff. So in the interview example, so I'm talking about the attachment interview here. So I mentioned that we do the 5 adjectives. Give me 5 adjectives that describe your partner or your relationship with your partner. And they give 5 adjectives first. So they say things, usually they'll always say loving or very loving, caring, hateful, deceitful, cheater. I mean, it could be good or bad, doesn't really matter in my book in terms of how we do the research. So if you're just doing self-reports, you would just simply write down the adjectives, but we don't really care about the adjectives. What we care about is the thing that follows the adjectives. So you get the 5 adjectives, and then for each adjective, the interviewer says, okay, you said loving. Can you give me a specific incident, specific time, specific episode from your relationship that illustrates that they were loving? So you ask them for an episodic example. So we're comparing levels of memory. We're comparing semantic, which is the adjective that's general, to specific episodes in their life. And we're curious about whether they match up. So a secure person, they match up. The story they tell you about the time that shows that their partner was loving or is loving. You can sit there as a outside person outside the relationship. You listen to the story, say, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I understand that. You were clear, you addressed that question, you were straightforward, and yes, it does sound like a loving thing that they did. By the way, for secure people, it doesn't have to be good stuff. If you say hateful, and the person gives a clear, straightforward episode that you listen to and you say, yeah, wow, that was hateful, that would also be considered secure. So it's that matching. So it's how they talk about things. By the way, just to sort of round it out, so preoccupied people, they don't match. So loving can turn into a story about fighting all the time, being vicious towards each other, and then crying, and then say, I love you. That's almost exactly a quote from a interview that I had. Not that I didn't do the interview, but I watched the interview. And then when you watch, so there's a couple things there. One is it's not very specific. Typically, people who are not secure don't have specific memories, and then they don't match. And typically with a preoccupied person, you'll see a lot of undifferentiated emotion. So the very loving adjective turns into about being vicious and having fights and crying, and then love gets tied into that. So it's called undifferentiated emotions. Love, hate, anger, sadness get all tied into one. So that would just be very much on how they talk about, again, the adjective. And then for dismissing people, very loving. So the example I give in my classes, which is actually an example from an interview, is I'm paraphrasing, but I think I could probably remember this pretty well. Loving, very loving. She's a very loving person. We're very loving people. And then the interviewer says, well, thank you, but can you give me a specific time, a specific event that shows this? And the guy says something like, well, just a big smile and quirkiness. So again, it's vague, right? There's no specific time there, and also doesn't seem to be a connection. Big smile, quirkiness is not loving, so it doesn't match. So that's an example of using interviews in terms of how they talk about things and having observers rate those things, such as the connection between the general semantic level, the adjectives, and the episodic level of memory, which is talking about events in the relationships and whether they match. And so observer reports, the good thing about them is there's some objectivity to them. So we have some objectivity. That's why we want more than 2 people. So it's really about, at least in terms of experts, how the person registers on other people. So we're just not taking their word from them. We actually want to see some outside perspective about their behavior. The downside of observer ratings is that typically observer methodologies, you only see the person for a limited amount of time. So typically you'd only see them in one situation. So you have what we call limited behavioral sampling. So you have your whole life and you're out doing things in your whole life. And if you're doing observational methodologies, in terms of quantitative ones, typically you're usually seeing somebody typically in a lab and under certain conditions. And so there might be some limitation to the generalizability of that, perhaps. So those are the simple pros and cons of observer methodologies. Another method is informant. So with informants, what we do is we ask people who know that person in everyday life to rate the stuff for them. We don't do it secretly. That would be unethical. What you do is you have the participant, and what you do is typically you do things such as, can you please list your 3 best friends, their phone number and their email, and let them know that we're going to be contacting them about you, and we're going to have them fill out some questionnaires about you. So you get people from their life that they nominate as your data. Sometimes they don't nominate them. So, for example, you might do like a lot of couples research, like research on marriages. They will use informant. The informant will be your partner. So you'll get some self-reports about the person, but then you'll ask them to talk about their partner or answer some questionnaires about their partner. And so you'll have the informant be the husband and wife of the person. So that's what an informant is. And informants are not trained, obviously. So the difference between observer and informant, big one is that the observer is a trained expert and using very systematic methodology. For the informants, they'll be getting questions similar to like what's on questionnaires or interviews in the self-report, but they're talking not about themselves, they're talking about their person that you're asking about, whether it's a friend or their husband and wife. The pros of informant is it's similar to observer in the sense that it's an outside perspective, correct? And it also has a pro of probably having a much broader behavioral sampling than the observers. So again, observers are usually doing it in a lab, so it's limited to certain situations. But the informant has had a lot more interactions with that person in different contexts. So there's a much broader behavioral sampling for the informants. A negative for the informants, and I'm guessing probably you're you might be saying, oh my gosh, if I did this, maybe my partner would say all sorts of weird things because my partner's a little bit weird. That can happen, right? So sometimes informants have bones to pick. So the informant might have some sort of bias. And so you're getting a different perspective, but maybe it's not an objective perspective, and maybe it's has a lot of bias just from the informant's perspective. This is why if you were doing this, I would say it'd be safer to do like the friends. Nominating 3 friends, at least you have 3 people. So if those 3 people agree, then you're kind of thinking there's probably something there. It's not just about bias. With the research on couples, so marriages, you only have one husband and one wife. So the bias could leak in a little bit more there. And typically what you would do again is you typically don't use these sources of data as the only source about a person. So you have other multiple methods. There's also what we call sort of task data. So task data are you have somebody do something, some sort of task. It could be like a response time. So a very sort of familiar psychological methodology is response time. So response time is usually pretty quick. It's in milliseconds. And so we'll have people react to something, a word. So we'll flash a series of words, and if you think that that word applies to your romantic relationship, press it. Press the red button. Red means yes, it applies. If it doesn't apply, then press the blue button. Doesn't apply. So you can take measurements of how quickly people press these things. And there's various other things. This is an example, but how quickly people say respond to something. Sometimes it's a go, no-go is a good example too. So you tell people that press this button if you see an emotion word. So if the word that comes up, that flashes up, is an emotion word, press that button as fast as you can. And you reward them. You want to give them some reward to make sure they're motivated. And basically, you have a bunch of words. Some are emotion words, some are not, like car, building should not be an emotion word. And what you do is you want to see whether people make a lot of mistakes. So you measure how many mistakes they make. Whoops, sorry about that. I just made a mistake. And then also how fast they go. This is actually a measure of impulsivity, for example. So the number of mistakes, if you're making a lot of mistakes, you're going to be pretty impulsive. So there's various tasks. I mean, you can think of 1,000 things. It could be a memory task, memorizing words, memorizing a story. It could be doing a maze. It could be solving a problem. There's all sorts of things you can do in terms of a task. So the upside, the positive things about a task, it's very objective. You can't argue about response time. Response time is response time, how fast you push the button. As long as your equipment's working, it's objective. It's accurate. It's 100% accurate and objective. There's no subjectivity. The downside of it is you better design your task really well. So if you think your task has some sort of psychological effect or is measuring some sort of psychological construct, you better have designed a really good task. Because if your task is not that great, doesn't match the thing you're trying to measure, your data is going to be totally meaningless. Yeah, you have objective numbers, but if your task sucks and it doesn't match your construct, then it's just garbage. Biological data. So biological data are things like fMRIs, so functional magnetic resonating imaging. And so we can take millisecond by millisecond, get a reading of the blood flow in your brain. And while you're doing tasks, whether there's what we call activation of some parts of your brain while you're doing a task, which is more blood flow. So that's part of the brain's becoming more active. And then deactivation, so if you're doing a task and then a part of the brain deactivates, there's less blood flow there. So that's what an fMRI is. We can measure your hormones, so we can stick you with a needle and measure your hormones. Now, sometimes it's not sticking with the needle. Sometimes it has to do with spit. Take your choice. Are you going to deal with blood or spit? But that spit analysis is quite expensive. So you can measure some types of hormones through the saliva of people, and you have to have them basically spin into a big tube, and you have to get quite a bit of spit to measure that. And things like heart rate. So there's all sorts of biological measures. Again, these are very objective. We know exactly how much change you have in your blood flow in your brain if we do the fMRI. We know exactly how much of a hormone that you have at that moment that we measure it. We know what your heart rate is. There's no ambiguity there. There's no interpretation. So they're very objective. That's the pro. The con is that how do you interpret these things? So what's the meaning of those things? So if you say that the amygdala is activated in your brain when you do this test, well, what does that exactly mean? Or if you have more of this hormone in your system at this specific point in time, the specific minute that we measured it, what does that mean psychologically? So that the psychological interpretation, the meaning of those data are perhaps a little bit more difficult. Probably with a lot of the biological data, it would be good to have, again, some other data related to that, whether it's observer, informant, or self-report. And then there's also this data technique that you don't see a lot in psychology, but is quite useful. It's called archival. So we can look at your, well, here Facebook, I feel like it's kind of old, like your Instagram perhaps, or your comments on other people's Instagram postings. And so, Facebook, social media, whatever social media you're on. So we could actually code that. We could, as long as, well, Facebook has gotten your permission. And by the way, I think Facebook owns Instagram, so they have the same user agreement. But as a researcher, you get permission from people, and then you would analyze their social media. And they've looked at this. They've looked at, for example, narcissism, and they've shown that narcissists have distinctive ways that they post about themselves versus non-narcissists. We can look at your text messages. This might sound weird to you, but this has been done in research, again, with permission. So if I'm studying romantic relationships, for example, I think there's actually programs you can have that tap into this. But basically, you get the permission of the person to get all the text that they sent to their partner, and then you get the permission of the partner too. So you have both sides. So you get permission from both people, and you can look at the text messages back and forth between the partners, and you can analyze them for various things. We could look at people's diaries, or if they keep some sort of journal online, which is a little bit different because that's more of a public thing. I don't know how many people keep diaries nowadays that are very personal and only they see it, but those diaries have been used to get psychological data on people, and people who are dead too. So some psychohistories have been done looking at groups of people and their diary entries and analyzing those things for psychological constructs. So archival, what it is, it's stuff that's already out there. We didn't ask them to do it. We didn't ask them to have an Instagram account or text their partners or to keep a diary. We didn't ask them to do it. That person was doing it already. Those things are out there. And all we need to do is we need to get some sort of permission and just look at that stuff. It's out there already. The nice thing about archival reports or data is that, in general, you hope that they're kind of conveying the truth. So there shouldn't be any reactivity. So in things like self-reports, there can be a lot of reactivity. So some people might lie to you, might change how they look, Archival should be a little bit more pure. The Dyers would be really pure, especially if they're dead now. But Facebook and text messages, maybe they'll clean it up, or the Instagram, they'll clean up their social media. So if they say, okay, go ahead and look at it, maybe they'll clean up their social media because they're afraid about how they'll look. So there might be some of that going on. The text messages, you might think, oh, well, if they both agree to it, then they're going to be really nice on the text messages. But what I'll say is usually with couples research, we usually don't worry about that too much, because maybe at first people will smile and put on a brave face and put on a false face in front of the researchers, but usually what happens pretty quickly, they start acting naturally. So I would not worry so much about the text messages research. They might start off being a bit artificial, but they're gonna end up being what they're really like pretty quickly. So that's archival, a positive. The negative is it might be difficult to get to the things that you're curious about. So obviously here the data were not intended to measure psychological constructs, and so as a researcher you have to be really clever in terms of how are you going to assess your psychological variables in data that were not meant to be psychological. So the downside is that you have to be very careful about your inferences about those data, because they were not made with the rigor of the other methodologies that we have here. So the endpoint here is that, and this might be in another slide, but I'm going to just do the endpoint right here. The endpoint is that each methodology gives us a different perspective of the person. So each methodology has its own positive aspects. Each methodology has its own limitations. And each methodology tells us something different about the person. But that's great, because if in the nomological network, over many studies, different researchers, different places, using different methodologies, if we add all of those different perspectives up and they tell us similar things, then something's really there. Also, when we do multiple methodologies, it makes up for the negative parts of the other methodology. So self-reports, we're worried about people are lying, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Well, observer reports and informant reports will help counteract that. And vice versa. So if we just have observer reports, we might think, well, we don't really understand the person, how they think about themselves. Well, ask them about themselves in addition to the observer reports. So we can get all of those different perspectives. So each one has a limited perspective, but if we add the other perspectives, add the other methodologies, it gives us a more holistic view of the person. So again, the idea is to do, maybe not within the study, but in a nomological network over many studies, have multiple methods about the same question. So in terms of these methodologies, of course, each of these methods has to be done very systematically. So none of these methodologies implies it being more sloppy or quicker. Each of these things has its own rigor to it. And so they have to be done very carefully and very systematically. So each method has a different affordance. Affordance means what we can understand about the person. So the affordance of self-reports is understanding the person's own view of themselves. Observer reports is how an expert would see them. Informant is how they register on people in their everyday lives. So how people in their everyday life react to that person. So these are the different affordances. And so depending on what your research question is, that often will guide your methodology. So if you're studying attachment and all you care about is what the person thinks about themselves, then do self-reports. If you're doing romantic attachment and you're really curious about how their behavior impacts on their partner, you better ask the partner. Don't ask the person, ask the partner, because you're curious about how the partner's impacted. So the choice of methodology often is from what do you want to learn about that research question. And as mentioned already, in the nomological network, over the long run, we want multiple methods over different studies by different researchers in different places. So here's a term here, psychological construct. So psychological construct is the thing we're trying to measure. So narcissism is a psychological construct, but I cannot directly observe narcissism. So I can't directly observe these things. This has sort of changed. Some of the biological things can be directly observed, obviously, so we can have a direct observation of your blood flow in your brain, your hormones, but for all those other psychological constructs, usually bigger than that, like narcissism, we can't directly measure that. We can only sort of think about, okay, what are sort of the representative tendencies of a narcissist? So how does a narcissist tend to think? How does a narcissist tend to feel? How does a narcissist tend to act? And so when we're thinking about psychological measurement, we know we can't just sort of take a picture of somebody and we can see what they're like, or we can't poke them with a needle and see how narcissistic they are. We have to think, well, how does this show up in the real world? Well, it shows up in how they think, how they feel, how they act. And so when we're thinking about the psychological construct, when we're actually trying to define it, we're trying to think about different domains, different manifestations of that construct. And again, the broad categories there is how do they think? Well, they think highly of themselves, and they think other people are stupid and inferior to themselves. How do they feel? Well, they only want to be positive. Everything's positive. If you're going to cry about things or be negative, just get away. I don't like negative stuff. How do they act? Well, they act pretty great if you kiss their ass. So if you're kissing their ass, they're going to be really happy and feel on top of the world. If you somehow don't fully agree with them, they're going to go nuts and be aggressive. And so we can think about all of these different ways that this thing can show up. So part of the measurement is defining how that construct would show up, how you can see aspects of it in different situations. And so in this way, we're thinking about how we can measure the psychological construct in things we can see. We can ask somebody how they think. We can ask somebody how they feel. We can watch them how they act. And these manifestations that we're observing directly are tied to some degree to what we call internal processes. So the internal processes of narcissism we can't see. But those internal processes will influence how people think, feel, and act, and we can see those things. We can measure those things. And of course, the big thing about this is your conceptual definition. So in your conceptual definition of your psychological construct, you think about all those different manifestations. How does a narcissist feel? How does a narcissist think? How do they behave? And so our conceptual definition should have all these different types of manifestations of that construct. And this is really important because the better your conceptual definition is, there's two things. There's several things, actually. One is you'll be clearer about what you're studying. You'll have a better understanding of it. And this definition can come from previous research, obviously, previous studies, previous theory. You're going to be using that a lot. You might add some things from your own observations, but you can use previous people's ideas and work to inform that. And then two, when you actually write your research up, you'll have a good way of explaining it to somebody. So not only do you understand it better, you can tell somebody, hey, this is what I mean by this, and they'll say, oh, okay, I understand it now. And then a really big thing is the better your conceptual definition, the better your measurement is. Because if you've defined your construct really well, and then it comes time to get your measurement, then then it's going to be pretty straightforward. And it's going to be very clear what you're going to be doing. Excuse me. So again, I mentioned this earlier, so you're going to be using previous research, theory, previous findings from research to help you define these things. And also this conceptual definition will become more elaborate over time. So for example, when you do a research study, when you first start off, you have a little bit of an idea about your variables that are in your research question, but you're probably not super clear about it. But you do some reading, you elaborate on that definition, you do your research. Probably after your research, you probably have some elaboration on the definition again. So this stuff becomes clear over time. And in terms of operational definitions, so conceptual definition is the concept. So conceptually, idea-wise, what is it like? We move from our conceptual definition to operational. Operational is how are you going to see it in your study? So essentially, how are you going to measure it? So we talked about this before. Pretty much hopefully for any psychological construct, you can measure it in any different ways. So I can think about each of these ways and I can measure narcissism to some extent. So there's different ways you can measure that construct, narcissism, for example. But you're not going to do everything in just one study. So you might just say, well, I'm going to do a self-report of narcissism in this study. Or I'm just going to do an observer report. That's fine. But again, in over many studies, there'll be different measures of narcissism. But in your study, it's probably going to focus on one specific way, whether it's self-report, observer, informant, etc. Sometimes people have what we call converging measures. So if you have multiple measures of the same construct, it'll be called converging. And so I was talking about earlier that in a couple studies I've done on romantic attachment, we had converging measures. We had interview, observer ratings of attachment, and we had self-reports from questionnaires. That would be converging measures. We'd have two separate measures of the same construct of romantic attachment. There is this idea of convergent validity. Convergent validity is how the things link together. So I'd say that our studies had convergent validity. So secure interview related pretty highly to secure in self-reports. Preoccupied interview related pretty highly to preoccupied self-reports. But then we have the dismissing people. So dismissing people who were dismissing in the interview, they showed up as secure in self-reports. That was actually convergent validity in the sense that it made sense. It made sense that secure people and anxious people were pretty self-aware of these things, but that the dismissing people would be in denial and say they're secure on self-reports. And in terms of doing research, sometimes people who are developing new measures will throw in an existing measure as convergent validity. So if I'm going to measure narcissism as a self-report, maybe I'm going to use this thing that's mentioned down here, which is maybe I'll use a diagnosis. Maybe I'll do a study. I'll find people who have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, and then I'll get people who have not. And then I'll have my questionnaire. And if my questionnaire works well, that group of narcissists who've been diagnosed as narcissists, their scores better be higher than the people who are not narcissistic. But let's say that it is higher. That would be convergent validity. I would have some convergent validity evidence for my measure. On my new questionnaire, narcissists scored higher than non-narcissists. and there was an objective outside measure of narcissism, the diagnosis. For this slide, I won't go into all the details because we did this earlier. So earlier in this lecture, we talked about nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio level of measurement. And we talked about the statistics for that. So I won't repeat it here. If you don't remember it, watch the earlier part of the video that talks about this. In terms of measurement, though, we also need to think about another question. Does the level of measurement capture the nature of the variable? In general, I'm sort of anti-nominal level measurement. So sometimes people who do research on personality, for example, they use nominal level measurement. So they'll, for example, look at narcissist versus non-narcissist, and oftentimes determine a narcissist versus non-narcissist by what they call median split. So they'll find a median score for the sample, and then if you're above it, you're narcissist. If you're below it, not narcissist. Or you could have people who study shyness, for example, and they'll have shy people and not shy people, and they'll put them in different groups. I don't like that because for things like personality, for example, it doesn't capture the nature of the variable. The world is not that there are narcissists and not narcissists. The nature of the world is that there's some extremely narcissistic people, some somewhat narcissistic people, some people kind of in the middle in narcissism, some somewhat not narcissistic, and some people are really, really not narcissistic. So people tend to be on the continuum. So in psychology, I would say that a lot of the variables we're looking at are actually on a continuum. And given that, if you start putting people in nominal categories, it doesn't really capture the real nature of the variable. You made something that's continuous and you made it into a yes or no, put people into boxes. So I think we don't want to do that. I don't think we want to put people in boxes when we do that. So if we have a median split, you're above the median, you're narcissist. If you're below the median, you're not narcissist. You can already see the problems with that. It's very arbitrary for the people that are close to the median. Also, what you do is you start assuming everybody's the same. So if I see you're a narcissist, you're all the same. Oh, you're not narcissist, you're all the same. So when we start putting people in boxes, we oftentimes start assuming that they're all the same, and that's, I think, a dangerous thing. So I would argue that many things that we look at, we should have it be interval level measurement rather than nominal. Obviously, if you're doing an experiment, typically the true IV that you're manipulating would be considered nominal, and I think that's okay, that's fine. But in terms of things like personality, I oftentimes see people put people in groups, and I don't like that because it really doesn't capture the nature of personality. So here's a major term that we need to know from this lecture, and I thought this lecture would be really short, but there's a lot of details in it too. So, but I think we're probably within 15 minutes or so of ending this, I hope. So a major concept, reliability and validity. Reliability is that, is it just consistent? So if you measure, is it consistent? So a very common way of thinking about this is, if I give you a measure on narcissism today, and I gave you that same measure next month, your score should be relatively the same. Assuming that your narcissism shouldn't change that quickly over 1 month's time, if I measure it twice, it should give me basically relatively the same number. It's consistent. Validity is different. Validity is it really measuring the thing you say you're measuring? So if I'm measuring narcissism, am I really measuring narcissism? So we often say that you need reliability for validity, but it's not sufficient. So reliability is a necessary condition for validity, because if I'm measuring narcissism and I have a measure and I measure you today and you're 12% narcissistic, I'm just going to use it as really rough like that, and I measure you next month and you're 98% narcissistic, I'd worry that my measure is not really measuring narcissism, it's something else, because narcissism shouldn't change that much. So if I don't have reliability, I'm not going to have validity. But just because I have reliability, it doesn't mean it's valid. So I could ask you some pretty stupid questions, basically. And I think I'm measuring narcissism, and I get consistency, but really, it's just consistent answers to stupid questions that don't really measure narcissism. So reliability is necessary, but not sufficient for validity. So we have different types of reliability. We have test, retest, which we just talked about just now. So if I gave you the test today on narcissism and I give it to you next month, are the scores the same? That's test, retest. Sometimes they have this thing called alternative forms. So let's say I have different questions. So I have narcissism questionnaire number 1. And I have a bunch of questions. I have 10 questions. Then I have narcissism questionnaire number 2, and they're different questions, but they're supposed to measure narcissism. That's called alternative forms. So if I give you questionnaire number 1, narcissism, and you get 9 out of 10, and I give you questionnaire number 2 for narcissism a month later, and you get 8 out of 10, that's pretty reliable. But those are alternative forms. I'm asking you different questions. There's also internal consistency. Internal consistency basically says when we measure something that's fairly complex, we want a bunch of different questions. And you can probably see that from the questions in the different studies that you're using for your research projects. So if I'm measuring something, I'm probably going to ask multiple questions. And so internal consistency is that all those different questions I have measuring narcissism, do people say roughly the same direction? So question 1 and 2 measure narcissism. If you say yes on 1, I hope you say yes on 2 too. So if you're narcissistic on question 1, narcissistic on question 2, question 3, question 4, or not, 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, that would be internal consistency. In terms of that variable, do you look similar across the different questions? They measure it in 2 ways. One way is split half, which is very crude. I don't think anybody does this anymore, but before computers, I guess, what they would do is, let's say I have 20 questions on narcissism. So split half would be I would just randomly choose 10 questions from that questionnaire. I would add up the answers. I would take the other 10 questions, add up the answers, correlate those scores. That would be a split half. So again, you take the full number of questions measuring the construct, you split them in half, you add up the score for one half, add up the score for the other half, and then correlate that. If it's relatively high correlated, then you have internal consistency. Cronbach alpha is much more common. Cronbach alpha is literally all the pairwise correlations for each question averaged. So I'm going to translate that for you. So let's say you have 20 questions. So you correlate question 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and 7, 1 and 8. So you have all the pairwise comparison for each question against all the other questions. You see on 20 questions it would be quite high. I can't remember my permutations right now, but probably around 400 I'm thinking, at least, if not 4,000, little pairwise comparisons. So what Cronbach alpha does, it takes all those correlations for each of the pairs of the questions and then averages it. So it averages the correlation. So that's a more sophisticated measure of internal consistency. So it's an average correlation among your items, essentially. And then we have inter-rater reliability. Say that fast a bunch of times if you have a speech impediment. So inter-rater reliability is what I was sort of talking about earlier. I was talking about observational reports. And so observational data, we want 2 or more people, observers, because we can't trust just one. We want to make sure people agree on what they see. And so inter-rater reliability is we simply correlate our raters, our observers. So if I have an observational measure of narcissism and observer A gave the score of 98 on a person and observer B gave a score of 12 to the person, I'd probably be worried. They're not really agreeing, so that would be low inter-rater reliability. If one gave 98 and the other one gave 90, that's relatively high agreement. So it's just the agreement among our observers about the same person. So all of these are about consistency. So reliability is about consistency, whether it's consistent over time, across our questions in a questionnaire, or across people, our observers. You can also obviously do it for informants. You can see how much your informants agree in terms of their ratings on a person. Validity is, I was going to say more important. Well, we need reliability, but validity is really the important question is, are we really measuring the thing we say we are? We need reliability to be valid, but reliability doesn't mean we're valid. So we have to ask that question, are we measuring the thing we're measuring? There's this thing called face validity. Face validity is simply somebody looks at your questionnaire and says, oh yeah, that measures narcissism. It's probably not the best measure of validity. In fact, you don't report this. You don't report your face validity in an article. Nobody would care about that. But you might do it because if you're doing a measure, you want to kind of look and see, does it seem to make sense? Sometimes we use subtle measures. Sometimes in questionnaires, for example, we have subtle measures, and so sometimes subtle measures may lack face validity, but we don't really care if it works. Subtle measures means it's not so obvious what we're asking. But really, the important parts of validity are what's following. So content validity is fairly important. So that's more systematic. That's mainly about domain coverage. Domain coverage means, did you cover what it really means to be a narcissist, for example? We want to capture the full nature of narcissist. This is where our conceptual definitions come into play. So if our conceptual definitions are well done, and we have a broad range of things in terms of how this construct shows up, then if we use that conceptual definition to help design our measurement, we're going to have very good domain coverage. So it's really important to have that defined in your conceptual definition, and then use your conceptual definition to create your methodology, your measurement. If you do that, then probably you're going to have domain coverage. This type of validity, we don't have any numbers, so there's no way to give a number for this. This is a judgment call. So we can't measure content validity per se, but what I'll say is that somebody, for one, you should judge that. You should make sure you have that. But again, if you're systematic and make sure that you use your conceptual definition, if you've done it well, that should lead to good measurement if you've used that definition to construct your measurement. But you will be judged on it, so when somebody outside of your study reviews your study, you would be judged on that. So you're not doing that here per se, but we'll talk a little bit about that maybe in the next lecture. But if you did a study and you wanted to get it published, somebody would certainly look at your measurement and make some sort of remark about the content validity if it was lacking. If you didn't measure some major component of a construct, that might actually lead to rejecting your study for publishing. And then the stuff you can measure are criterion validity. Criterion means that there's something outside the measure. So criterion means that you're using some sort of criteria outside of the measure to judge its validity. So concurrent validity, that's actually quite easy, and I shouldn't say quite easy, but quite simple. So for example, if we know from previous research that narcissists are aggressive, and I have a new measure of narcissism, and I have an old validated measure of aggression, if my new measure of narcissism relates to that validated measure of aggression, I have concurrent validity. Concurrent means at the same time. I measure narcissism now. If it relates to aggression now, then I have concurrent validity. There's also predictive validity. So, for example, predictive validity could be a test. So I have a test, and I think it's a test on how well community college students will do in their classes. And I give everybody who's new to community college the first week, I give them that test. And then I take the score from that test, and then I see if it relates to people's grades, first semester, second semester, third semester, fourth semester, etc. That would be predictive validity. So I measure something, and I'm seeing if I can predict future behavior. So if my test in the first week of community college relates to GPAs throughout a person's career, that would have predictive validity then. Convergent validity, we just talked about that. So convergent is I'm comparing my new measure of something to some sort of existing measure. So what we did literally is that we compared a new new interview measure of romantic attachment to existing measures of attachment that were self-report. So a self-report questionnaire was used in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of research studies. So it was definitely a validated measure, self-report. And then we used our new interview measure and compared it against that to get convergent validity. And then the last type of criterion validity here is what we call divergent or discriminant. So convergent means if you're measuring the same thing, it should give you some of the same scores. There should be convergence. But do remember, for the attachment, it was converge for secure, converge for preoccupied, but for people that were dismissing on the interview, they said they were secure on the self-report. And that to us was convergent evidence, because that's what we would predict based on attachment theory and research. Divergent is a little bit more straightforward. Divergent is you're measuring something different, and you want to make sure that you're measuring something that's distinct. And so I'm going to use our interview measure of attachment again. So we have our interview measure of attachment. You can imagine that some people might say, well, you're having people observe and how people talk. Maybe people's scores on attachment is being influenced by their verbal IQ. So if your verbal IQ is high, maybe that will make you sound more secure. If you're low, it's going to make you sound more dismissing, perhaps. Well, we had divergent validity on this. We had IQ. We had very elaborate measures of IQ. And what we did is we correlated our attachment scores with our IQ scores, and the correlation was literally about 0. It was, I think, 0.01. So there was absolutely no relationship between our attachment scores and IQ. So we could say to people then, this interview is not biased. It's not measuring some sort of verbal fluency and being able to talk. It's not. It's something different than that, and it seems to be attachment. So that's divergent validity. So some practical considerations. I think we talked about this before, so the first part, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it now, but existing versus constructing a new measure. So I think I told you the story before, but basically the thing about the existing versus constructing is time frame. So to validate a new measure takes about 5 years. So sometimes constructing a new measure can be more difficult because it might be less likely to be accepted by people. So sometimes you use existing measures if there is an existing measure of something, even if it's not perfect, because it's been validated already. It's accepted. Social desirability is something to think about. So social desirability relates to that thing I was talking about earlier, which is people want to look good. So sometimes people lie on purpose because they want to look good. So I don't want to look like a hothead. So if you're going to ask me about being aggressive, I might lie a bit because I don't want to look like I'm a hothead, because people think hotheads are hotheads. They don't like them. So there's some social desirability there. And so, especially in questionnaires, we really care about that. So one way around that is, for one, construct your questions well. For two, there are measures of social desirability. So sometimes people mix in their questions for the construct that they're measuring with the social desirability questions. So these social desirability questions are supposed to highlight people who are essentially lying to look good. And usually the social desirability questions are too good to be true. So things like, I never lie, I never swear, I never get angry, I never speed, I never do traffic violations, all these things, like too good to be true. And so if somebody scores high on those questions measuring social desirability, you might think twice about whether you want to include them, because there's some indication that they may have been lying for your other questions that you have for your variables, your construct that you're trying to measure, because they were lying on the social desirability questions. So those social desirability questions are meant to identify people who are doing that type of lying. And basically, that's one of those things. And related to that are also demand characteristics. So we talked about demand characteristics in terms of people think they're trying to guess what you want them to do. So certain tasks that you have people do will have, experimental situations will have demand characteristics. The person thinks they're supposed to do something. If they react to that, then that could be problematic, because they're not acting naturally. They're acting the way that they think you want them to act. So we have to be careful also about this type of possibility with experiments. So it's not just questionnaires where people are trying to look good. They can also try to look good in the lab, in experiments, if they think that there's something that they're supposed to be doing that you want them to do. And then there's this practical consideration of lie good, lie bad. So we've been talking about kind of lie good. So lie good is like social desirability. Lie bad is, I'm going to make myself look worse than usual. Typically where we see lie good and lie bad are in maybe like psychiatric hospitals, or definitely in forensic situations. So there are questionnaires like the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, just basically saying it's a big personality questionnaire developed at the University of Minnesota. And they've used MMPI in a lot of forensic settings, for example. So you get somebody in a forensic setting, criminal setting, like in a jail, because it's probably before conviction. But you could do it, in prison too if you want to. But definitely in jail, it would be standard to evaluate somebody's psychiatric condition to see if they should continue going and being in jail and being tried and thrown to prison if they're guilty, or whether there's a psychiatric condition that needs to be treated, and they then go on another pathway. So in that situation, you want to have some sort of detection about whether somebody's faking it. So sometimes people fake good. So sometimes people deny that something's wrong with them. So we want to know if they're faking good, because they're lying to us. They're trying to cover up something that's wrong. In a forensic situation, I would say that we're really concerned about faking bad. So somebody wants to fake a mental disorder because they think that they're going to get easier treatment in terms of the prison, or avoiding prison. And so the MMPI has both. The MMPI has a lying good scale and a lying bad. So you can tell whether somebody's faking it in a way that they want to look good, they want to look better than they really are, or faking it that they want to seem like something's wrong with them when really there's nothing wrong. The lying bad scale tends to have, again, there are things that are fairly extreme, but are not necessarily tied to psychological disorders, but to somebody who's not an expert in the field, sounds like if you had a psychiatric disorder, you should have something like that. So there's a bunch of items that common everyday people think, oh yeah, if you have something wrong with you, you would probably do that type of stuff. But it's just meant to flag you as lying and faking it. So that's another practical consideration. Probably in sort of just standard research, we're probably more concerned about the lying good. The lying bad, we're not so worried about because we're not making decisions about punishment, for example, for people. That's it. So this is a bit shorter than previous ones. We had one slide that was really long, which was the different methodologies. That took a while to get through. But these are the things that you need to know about psychological measurement. And I will talk to you next time when we will talk specifically about constructing questionnaires. And I will talk to you later.